I was halfway through rearranging the old records on the shelf when Chloe appeared at my door, her eyes wide, cheeks flushed as if she had run across town just to reach me. The sight alone made me pause. She had that restless energy that carried urgency like a perfume, subtle, but impossible to ignore. She looked at me as if she were balancing on the edge of something invisible, something that might break if she leaned the wrong way. "Finja ser meu noivo nesta festa," she said, her voice a mixture of plea and jest, the Portuguese words slipping past my understanding for a brief instant before the meaning sank in. Pretend to be her fiancé at the family gathering. My first instinct was to laugh, but I caught the tremor in her lips that held it back. This wasn't a joke. I set the records aside, keeping my hands calm, steady. "And what happens if it becomes true forever?" I asked quietly, letting the question hang between us. She blinked, almost startled that I didn't recoil, that I didn't brush off her request as absurd. There was something in the stillness of my voice that invited honesty, or maybe it just mirrored the quiet steadiness she craved. She shrugged, the tension in her shoulders tightening. "I don't know. I just need someone there. Someone who doesn't look away." Her words were small, almost swallowed by the space around them, but they carried a weight that tugged at the edges of my curiosity. I studied her then, the nervous way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the faint quiver in her hands. People rarely asked me for this kind of help, for a presence without strings attached, and yet here she was. I nodded slowly. "All right, I'll do it." For tonight, there was no grand promise, no declaration of intent, just a quiet decision. She exhaled, the sound so faint I almost missed it, and a small smile flickered across her face. We drove together in silence, the kind that doesn't need words. Traffic blurred past us, lights stretching into thin ribbons of amber and red. I could feel her glance at me now and then, tentative, as if testing the waters of a river she wasn't sure she wanted to cross. I didn't flinch under her scrutiny. I didn't need to. My calmness was my offering, my way of showing her she wouldn't have to navigate the evening alone. When we arrived, her family was in full motion, laughter and chatter filling the large hall. I felt her hand brush against mine briefly as we stepped inside, a quiet plea for reassurance. I didn't squeeze, didn't pull away. I simply matched her pace, letting her lean on me without asking for anything in return. Throughout the night, I observed her carefully. She laughed when she could, but her eyes betrayed a constant awareness, a subtle calculation of how to appear safe in a room that felt slightly hostile, slightly too large for comfort. I made it easy for introductions, light conversation, a steady shoulder to rest against during the louder moments. No theatrics, no exaggeration, just presence, just choice. By the time the evening drew to a close, she had relaxed enough to touch my arm without hesitation, to let herself lean slightly, just a little, into the reassurance I offered. And I realized that tonight wasn't just a performance for her family. It was a first step towards something neither of us had planned, something that began not with passion, but with trust. The morning after the party, I found myself thinking about Chloe more than I expected. Not in a restless, consuming way, but in a quiet, observant way, the kind that notices details others miss. The way her fingers lingered over the edge of the coffee cup, or how her eyes darted toward the window whenever a thought unsettled her. When she called to thank me, it wasn't just politeness. There was a weight behind her words, a mixture of relief and lingering tension that I felt rather than. "She suggested we meet again, casually," she said, but the undertone hinted at a desire to continue something unspoken. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to be there. That's how it started. Our hours together were filled with small gestures and conversations that didn't need to be monumental. We walked along quiet streets, talked about books neither of us had finished, or simply sat in companionable silence. During those afternoons, I noticed the little hesitations, the subtle ways she tried to protect herself. Chloe had a habit of holding back laughter until she was certain it was safe, tilting her head as if testing the waters before committing to a thought or a feeling. I never rushed her, never tried to draw her out forcefully. Instead, I offered presence, the kind that doesn't demand, doesn't question, simply exists. That was my choice. She could lean in or step back, and either was fine. One day, she mentioned her family, the expectations and quiet pressures that made her feel perpetually. She spoke softly, almost in fragments, as though some pieces of her story were too delicate to assemble fully. I didn't interject. I simply listened, letting the words settle between us without judgment. There was a comfort in that silence, in knowing that someone could hear without trying to fix everything. Later, while we shared a meal at a small cafe tucked between old brick buildings, she laughed at something I said. It was tentative at first, a little shaky, but it became real laughter that spread into her eyes. I smiled, noting the shift, subtle but undeniable. She was beginning to let herself relax, to trust that being near me wasn't a risk. And in that moment, I felt the quiet thrill of connection, the kind that doesn't demand fireworks or dramatic gestures, just the slow ignition of understanding. Walking her home, she paused at her doorstep, lingering as if uncertain how to end the evening. I didn't fill the silence. I waited. Eventually, she said, almost in a whisper, "Thank you for just being here." Her hand brushed mine lightly, not seeking contact, not needing it, but allowing it. That single gesture spoke volumes. Trust. Acknowledgement. A subtle invitation to continue walking beside her in her world. Step by careful step. The evening air was cool, and she finally turned toward her door, giving me a look that held a quiet question. Was this the start of something real, or just a borrowed comfort? I let her wonder, offering only a steady presence and a nod that said, without words, "I am here. Whatever comes next, it can wait." We found ourselves retreating from the noise of the city one Sunday afternoon, wandering through a small park tucked between buildings that had seen better decades. Chloe moved slowly, her hands brushing over the rough edges of the railing along the footbridge. She glanced at me occasionally, as if measuring whether my pace matched the rhythm she needed. I didn't rush, didn't try to fill the silences that stretched comfortably between us. Silence, I realized, was one of the few things that truly allowed her to exhale. She spoke in fragments at first, testing the air with tentative words. "I haven't really told anyone this," she admitted, voice soft, almost swallowed by the ambient rustle of the leaves, "about how my family expects things." Her eyes lowered to the ground, tracing cracks in the pavement as if they could bear the weight of what she didn't dare say aloud. I didn't interrupt. I simply walked beside her, shoulders loose, hands in pockets, and let her continue. "Sometimes I feel like I have to perform just to exist," she murmured. There was no exaggeration, no dramatics, only the bare, honest fatigue of someone carrying expectations she hadn't chosen. I nodded, slowly, letting the motion acknowledge her words without judgment. My presence alone, steady and unassuming, seemed to offer her permission to release the tension. We paused by a bench under a broad maple tree. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a shifting mosaic on the ground. Chloe sat, folding her hands over her knees, while I leaned against the railing nearby. She didn't ask for advice, didn't seek solutions. She simply needed to be heard, and in that quiet act of listening, a bond began to form. I could feel it like a pulse. Tentative, fragile, but undeniably there. Hours passed in the same gentle rhythm. We spoke of trivial things, of books of meals we had forgotten to try. The ordinary details, the small attentions, became bridges between us. At one point she laughed, a light, delicate sound, unburdened, and I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing. Her laugh didn't need validation. It was simply shared, acknowledged, and that was enough. Before leaving, I offered her a jacket when the afternoon chill settled in. She hesitated, then accepted with a soft smile, the first real acknowledgement of our growing closeness. Her hand lingered slightly on mine as I zipped it up, and though the touch was fleeting, it carried a quiet significance, a subtle signal that she was beginning to feel safe enough to lean, however cautiously, on someone else. As we parted, she glanced back with a look that was both hesitant and trusting. I nodded, not to promise anything dramatic, but to assure her that I would be there when she needed someone steady, step by step, silence by silence. The foundation of something that could endure was quietly being. It was a quiet Thursday when she called, her voice strained, clipped at the edges like it was holding back something heavy. She didn't ask for company, not exactly. She simply said she needed someone to come by, someone who wouldn't notice the disarray of her apartment or the worry that clung to her posture. I didn't hesitate. I drove through the city streets, headlights slicing through the fog that had settled over, and arrived with nothing but a calm presence. She opened the door, and there it was. Her day, spilled across the floor in a mess of papers, dishes, and anxiety. She tried to apologize for the chaos, but I waved it off. "It's fine," I said. "You don't have to explain anything." She blinked, almost startled at the lack of judgment, at the absence of an agenda. That small pause, the space between words and expectations, seemed to relieve a fraction of her tension. I set down the container of soup I had brought, silently making my way to the small kitchen to heat it. Chloe sat on the edge of the couch, knees tucked beneath her chin, and watched me move with a calm, deliberate efficiency. She didn't speak it. There was no need. Our presence together in that apartment was enough. I could feel her slowly exhaling, a subtle shift in posture that said more than any words could. When I handed her the bowl, she murmured a quiet thanks, not the perfunctory kind that is said out of habit, but one that carried an acknowledgement of being seen, of being understood. We ate in silence, sharing a simple meal, and yet the act felt intimate in its ease. I didn't press her to speak, didn't push her to tell me more than she wanted. She chose what she shared, and that choice was a gift I didn't take lightly. Afterward, she perched on the couch, curling her legs beneath her as she watched me clear the kitchen. I sat beside her eventually, leaving the distance she seemed to need. We didn't hold hands, didn't lean on each other. Instead, we shared space, a quiet solidarity that required no labels or promises. She glanced at me, eyes soft, and said something about how rare it was to find someone who could just be there without expectation. I simply nodded, offering only the assurance of continued presence. Later, as I left, she walked me to the door. There was a brief pause, her hand almost brushing mine before she retracted it. That fleeting contact, tentative and cautious, carried more meaning than any words could. I smiled slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that the gesture was seen and reciprocated, even if only in understanding. Step by step, moment by moment, she was learning to let someone in, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the possibility of safety. The night air was crisp as I drove home. I kept thinking about the quiet shift and the subtle trust beginning to form. Nothing was declared, nothing forced. Yet the evening had changed something. An invisible thread had been laid between us. Unspoken but undeniable, a promise of something gentle and enduring. The afternoon was gray, the kind of soft light that makes everything seem muted and distant. Chloe called me from, voice low, tinged with fatigue. Her day had stretched longer than she expected, each task piling on top of the last, until she sounded as though she had been moving through molasses. I didn't hesitate to go to her. I knew that presence sometimes mattered more than words, and she needed someone who didn't ask for explanations, someone who could simply occupy the space beside her. When I arrived, the apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of her computer and the occasional shuffle of papers. She barely noticed me at first, already immersed in the remnants of her day. I placed the soup on the counter and unpacked a thermos of tea, making small movements that went unnoticed, but were deliberate. Chloe's eyes eventually lifted, and I caught a flicker of gratitude there, subtle but unmistakable. We ate without hurry, the clock ticking in the background, our conversation sparse yet comfortable. She shared fragments of her work frustrations, the faint worry that she would never measure up to the expectations around her. I didn't offer solutions or platitudes. Instead, I listened, letting her voice fill the room, giving weight to words that often went unheard. After the meal, I cleared the dishes without prompting, and she watched, quiet, not tense. There was a small smile, the kind that emerges when someone realizes they don't have to perform or pretend. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, and let the moment stretch without intrusion. Chloe leaned back into the couch, curling her legs beneath her, a small sign of relaxation. Later, we ended up in the living room, the city light spilling across the floor. She rested her head against the couch arm, eyes distant, and I sat nearby, a careful distance apart. No hands touched, no pressure existed, just the comfort of shared space. I could feel her tension easing, her body slowly reclaiming itself from the stress of the day. It was a quiet intimacy, nothing dramatic, but more profound than anything either of us had admitted aloud. Before leaving, she opened the door and paused, as if considering whether to say something more. Her glance lingered, not seeking, not demanding, simply weighing possibility. I nodded, reassuringly, and she let herself close the door without a word. That tiny acknowledgement, her trust, tentative but growing, was more significant than any declaration. Driving home, I felt the subtle shift in her energy, the weight of her walls beginning to ease. The gestures were small, ordinary, yet they were building a pattern, a rhythm. Step by step, soup by tea, silence by careful conversation, a bond was formed. Neither forced it, neither demanded it, yet it carried a quiet, unspoken promise of constancy, the kind that lingers long after the moment passes. We met that evening under the dim glow of the streetlights, the city around us buzzing softly, indifferent to the quiet gravity of our steps. Chloe had suggested a walk, casual and unscheduled, and I agreed without hesitation. There was a rhythm in walking beside her, a silent acknowledgement that neither of us had to speak to fill the space. Yet, the unspoken words between us carried a weight that made the silence feel significant. She hesitated a corner, glancing at me as if deciding whether to take my arm. I offered it without a word, my movement natural, unassuming. She accepted, lightly brushing her hand against mine. The contact was minimal, tentative, but it shifted something invisible. A line crossed from acquaintance to presence, from caution to tentative trust. The gesture, though simple, carried an unspoken message. You are safe here, with me, for as long as you need. Chloe spoke, eventually, of an old fear she hadn't shared with anyone in years. A worry of being overlooked, dismissed, or abandoned. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, but there was an edge of courage in revealing it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to reassure her with clichés. I let the words settle, absorbing them silently, offering a stillness that she could lean into without judgment or expectation. We walked on, the city a backdrop of muffled noises and distant lights. At times, she would glance at me, searching for a reaction, a sign that I was engaged in more than the surface of our steps. My gaze met hers steadily, and that simple acknowledgement seemed to give her permission to relax, to let some of the armor she carried fall away. We didn't talk about the future, about intentions or promises. We only allowed the present to exist fully, the way one might pause to listen to the quiet before a storm passes. Eventually, we found ourselves sitting on the edge of a low wall near the river. Water reflected the muted glow of lamps, rippling softly. Chloe's head tilted slightly, resting against my shoulder, not seeking comfort, not demanding it, but leaning enough to show tentative trust. I didn't move. I didn't adjust. I simply remained, letting her settle into the safety of presence without pressure, letting the silence speak louder than any reassurance could. As the night deepened, the unspoken connection between us grew, subtle but undeniable. I realized that these gestures, this stillness, this careful attention, was becoming more significant than any words could convey. Chloe didn't need promises yet. She needed acknowledgement, constancy, someone who could exist beside her without haste, without demand. And in that quiet, I could see the first glimmers of something deeper beginning to take shape. Chloe mentioned him casually, almost as if testing the air. Her ex had reached out, claiming to want to reconnect. She didn't ask for advice. She only shared the fact, her voice light but betraying an undercurrent of uncertainty. I listened quietly, arms resting loosely on the edge of the table, giving her the space to weigh her own emotions. She didn't need me to guide her, only to witness what she was feeling without judgment. Her hesitation was palpable. She spoke of old memories, of the comfort and the mistakes, of the moments that had drawn her back into what she now realized wasn't enough. I stayed silent, letting her navigate the history on her own terms. I could sense the conflict, the pull of familiarity versus the subtle awakening of something new. And though the temptation to offer reassurance was present, I knew my place wasn't to persuade her, but to provide calm, unwavering presence. You deserve someone who stays because they choose to, not because they won, I said finally, soft but firm, letting the words settle between us. She looked at me then, eyes wide, not from surprise but from recognition of a truth she hadn't allowed herself to fully admit. My voice had no urgency, no demand, only clarity, and in that clarity, I sensed a shift in understanding that choosing herself could be an act of courage, and choosing someone new could be safe, if it was voluntary and deliberate. The conversation lingered in her mind long after. She didn't respond immediately, didn't seek validation or guidance. She only sat with it, processing, letting the possibility of making a conscious choice sink in. The ex faded from the immediate picture, irrelevant in the presence of a calm, steady alternative she hadn't expected to find. Later, we walked through the quiet streets, the night air crisp against our faces. She spoke in fragments, carefully measured words that revealed layers of vulnerability, of the desire to protect herself without isolating entirely. I matched her pace, neither pressing nor retreating, simply existing as a constant she could rely on. She glanced at me once, eyes searching for a signal I would not provide, because the signal was not mine to give. It was hers to accept, hers to cultivate. At the doorstep of her building, she lingered, almost testing the weight of the night. I said nothing. I merely waited, letting her choose whether to invite me in or leave me outside. That pause, charged with unspoken questions and quiet decisions, revealed more than any declaration of intent could. It was in these moments, small, deliberate, unspectacular, that the foundation of trust and intimacy grew. She began to see that presence could be more profound than words, more enduring than temporary comforts. And I understood that this realization, slow as it was, marked the emergence of something neither of us had anticipated but both had been quietly cultivating. The afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the skyline when Chloe suggested we meet at the small park in her apartment. I arrived first, settling onto a bench with my hands folded loosely, noticing the way the light touched the edges of her hair as she hesitated, eyes flicking to me, a mixture of determination and uncertainty in her expression. I remained still, letting her make the first move, letting her sense the absence of pressure in my calm presence. She sat down beside me, knees bent, hands folded in her lap. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She was absorbing the quiet, the way the world continued around us while we existed in this small bubble of stillness. Eventually, she said, almost in a whisper, "I've never allowed myself to choose for me before." The words were tentative, heavy with the weight of past fears, and I let the silence hold them, giving her space to continue. "I'm afraid," she admitted after a pause. That if I choose someone, it could all fall apart. Her eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the trees, tracing invisible lines only she could see. I didn't move to reassure her. Instead, I offered a gentle nod, a subtle acknowledgement that she didn't need my permission to feel fear, only someone steady to exist beside her while she confronted it. I spoke slowly, deliberately, careful not to diminish or dismiss. I'm not here to convince you. I'm here because I want to be, because I choose to be. But the choice is yours, always, and that makes it real. Her gaze shifted to me then, and for the first time that afternoon, I saw the faintest spark of clarity in her eyes, the beginnings of understanding that safety and choice could coexist. We walked a while, our steps unhurried, matching the rhythm of the park paths that curved through the fading light. She lingered close enough to feel my presence, not seeking it, not needing it, just allowing it to exist. In this small distance, she seemed to test the boundaries of trust, gauging whether it could be offered without demand, without expectation. At the edge of the park, she paused and looked at me, lips pressed together, eyes questioning. I did not rush to answer. I did not need to. The quiet between us carried the weight of what was unspoken, the possibility of choice, the courage to accept it, the gentle promise of someone unwavering. She exhaled softly, a sign that the fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. The awareness that she could choose, truly, deliberately, had begun to root itself in the space we were sharing. The city lights flickered on as we parted ways, a soft reminder that the world continued. But in that moment, the pause, the calm, and the deliberate steadiness created something enduring, a first step toward trust that wasn't demanded, but offered and accepted quietly, intentionally. Months had passed since that first evening when she asked me to pretend, and now the invitation arrived again. Another gathering, another family event, but with an undercurrent of a different expectation. Chloe's message was light, teasing even, but I sensed the weight beneath. This was more than just a party. It was a moment she wanted to navigate with someone she trusted, someone steady. When I arrived, she met me at the door with a small, genuine smile, eyes searching mine with a mixture of anticipation and caution. "Come as my boyfriend," she said, half in jest, half with sincerity. I responded simply, "Only if you come as yourself." No pretending necessary. Her gaze softened, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. That unspoken agreement created a calm space for us, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust that had been building over time. Inside, the room buzzed with chatter, clinking glasses, and the subtle hum of expectations. I remained close, a steady presence at her side, letting her guide the interactions while I ensured the moments of discomfort passed unnoticed. I offered introductions with natural ease, engaged in light conversation without overshadowing her, and adjusted to the shifts of attention, always subtly protective, always attentive. Chloe gradually relaxed, her laughter becoming genuine, unguarded. I noticed the difference, the way her body leaned just slightly closer, the way her eyes would find mine for a brief reassurance before returning to the crowd. At one point, we stepped onto a balcony for a quieter moment, the night stretching out beyond the railing. Chloe exhaled, letting the tension of the evening escape in a soft sigh. She didn't ask for comfort, and I didn't offer platitudes. I simply stood beside her, letting the quiet between us speak volume. She rested her hand lightly against the brushing against mine as it passed, a fleeting contact that spoke more than words ever. Later, as the night drew to a close, she lingered near the door, hesitant to step back into the solitude beyond the party. I didn't rush her. I merely stayed, a calm, steady presence, letting her feel the security of someone who would wait without expectation. She finally turned to me, eyes bright with unspoken acknowledgement, and for a moment, everything else, the chatter, the expectations, the roles, faded. As we walked home, side by side in quiet companionship, it was clear that this evening had shifted something subtle yet profound. The trust between us was no longer tentative. It had grown into a quiet understanding, a mutual choice to be present, to lean on one another in small ways that mattered more than grand gestures ever could. And though nothing had been declared outright, the promise of continuity hung in the air, gentle but unmistakable. The late afternoon light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the living room where Chloe and I had settled with mugs of tea. There was no rush, no agenda, only the quiet presence that had defined our time together for months. She leaned back against the couch, knees drawn up, eyes tracing the patterns the sunlight made on the floor. I watched her, noticing how her posture had relaxed, how the tension that had once clung to her shoulders seemed to have loosened over time. She spoke first, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "And if this becomes real, not just tonight, not just at a party, what if it lasts forever?" The words hung between us, fragile and tentative, yet heavy with the weight of possibility. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to fill the space with reassurance or promises. Instead, I let her question linger, letting her hear in the quiet that she wasn't alone in considering it. Her eyes met mine, searching for an answer, for a sign that I felt the same subtle shift that had been unfolding between us. I smiled faintly, the movement small but deliberate, a gesture that carried more meaning than words could. Then it would be because we chose it, I said, steady and calm, my voice neither dramatic nor... Not because it was expected, not because we needed to, but because we wanted to. She nodded, absorbing the words, and I could see the beginnings of relief, the faint recognition that choice could coexist with trust, that permanence could be gentle rather than imposing. We didn't speak for a while after, letting the silence stretch comfortably. There was no rush to define the future, no pressure to declare what had already been forming quietly in the spaces between us. I reached out, and she allowed her hand to rest lightly against mine, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement and mutual understanding. No overt declaration, no fiery confession, just presence, calm and grounding her in a sense of safety and months to establish. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the small universe we had carved in this room. The afternoon waned into evening, and yet the quiet connection persisted, unshaken. It was not a culmination, not an ending, but a continuation, a subtle promise carried in shared glances, in the steady cadence of breaths, in the choice to remain present without demand. As she leaned back, closing her eyes briefly, I realized that what had begun as a borrowed pretense had evolved into something quietly profound, something that neither of us had rushed, something that had grown from small gestures, patience, and the steady decision to simply be. And in that calm, deliberate presence, the question of forever no longer felt impossible. It only felt like the next step, gentle, unforced, and entirely ours.